What we saw in the previous video is how by thinking about the object, and in particular the transcendental object, or this transcendental idea of the object, Kant manages to advance his argument a very important step. Right? Because what he was able to show there is that if objects are given to us in experience, right, if we become aware of objects as something that goes beyond the mere subjective play of sensations, something that is objective, something that can ground a rule for experience, then the understanding must be applicable to it. And in particular, the categories must be applicable to it. But we also saw that this might leave open a worrisome possibility. And the worrisome possibility is that, okay, so maybe we don't have that kind of experience. Right? Maybe on philosophical reflection, what we have to say is that this very idea of an object that stands apart from the mere subjective sensation is a mistake, and mere subjective sensation is all that there is. Now, that's not what Kant thinks. And in order to see why Kant doesn't think that that is a possibility that we need to take seriously, how we can know in advance that we will have objective experience, we need to consider the other part of the equation. And the other part of the equation, well, the other part of the structure here, after having looked at the object, is the subject. So in this video we will think about the subject, and we will think about the relation between subject and object. And apart from helping us understand this objective nature of experience and the application of the categories to experience, this is also, I think, going to be the place where Kant mounts his most fundamental attack to Cartesian external world skepticism. Right? So Cartesian external world skepticism basically starts by positing the subject and the object, and then saying, hey, how do I get those two together? Right? And as is well known, the only way that Descartes gets them together is by having God, sort of mediate between them. That is not an option for Kant, but Kant is going to argue that if we think through the notions of subject and object, we're gonna find out they're not like this, but they're like this. Right? That the notions of subject and object cannot be pried apart, that both of them require the other. Alright, so that is the promissory note. Now let's see what Kant is going to do. Okay, in the first video we started by thinking what is the object. Let's now think about what is the subject. Now, some radical empiricists have been tempted to identify the subject with this mere play of subjective sensations. It's like saying that is what we are, right? We just are this sort of bundle of subjective sensations. That is a very minimal conception of the subject, and in fact I think that if we look at somebody like Hume, who comes pretty close to being a very radical empiricist, we can see why this doesn't really work. Right? In order to make sense of our subjectivity, we need a little bit more, it seems, than the mere play of sensations. And so, for instance, Hume, in order to explain how thinking works, right, and obviously we can think, right, in order to explain how thinking works, in order to explain how our grasp of the world works, Hume puts a lot of emphasis on the idea of custom, right? And sort of the most basic thing that custom can do is it can, if I see A and B and A and B and A and B, then custom can generate expectations, right? If I see A again, I expect B. And this, for Hume, is going to be fundamental for our grasp of causation. In a sense, it's going to be our grasp of causation. And then it is going to be fundamental for basically our understanding of the entire world. But in positing custom, right, as a kind of mechanism that is not itself an element of sensation, Hume is in fact expanding the subject beyond the mere subjective stream of sensations. Right? Custom and these relations that custom has generated are not there. They are not elements of the stream of sensation, of this mere subjective play of perceptions. And so even somebody like Hume, who tries to be very empiricist and very minimal, in order to make sense of our subjectivity, needs to posit something that goes beyond the mere play of sensations. Okay. So that's a path that Kant thinks is inaccessible to us. Right? The subject is not just the mere play of sensations. Okay, here's another option on the table. It's Descartes' option. It's the idea that we are sort of immediately aware of ourselves as a thinking substance. Right? I am a substance that essentially thinks. Now, that is also a road that Kant does not want to treat. Right? He doesn't want to treat it because he thinks that we are not aware of ourselves as a substance. Right? I mean, how are we given to ourselves as a substance? Well, Kant is going to actually have a lot to say about that when we get to the part of the critique that is called the paralogisms. And there he is going to argue that we are not given to ourselves as a substance, that only like substance is a category, right, for Kant. It can only be applied to experience. It can only be justified. That is what the transcendental deduction is trying to do. It can only be justified in relation to experience. But this self, this Cartesian self, is supposed to be what has the experiences, right? It's not supposed to be something in experience, and in fact we do not find it in experience, right? It's not the case that in experience, apart from like my sensations, I also experience this substance that is me, right? So for Kant this doesn't make any sense. It's just not true that we grasp ourselves as a substance. And if we did grasp ourselves as a substance, well, actually, we would be grasping something like some object in experience, that an experience that is had by the subject, and so that couldn't really be a grasp of the subject, right? Okay, this is actually maybe the third road that Kant wants to exclude, the idea that the subject can be given in experience, right? So we don't identify it with experience, we don't think of it as the substance that maybe has the experiences. We think of it as something that is given in experience. Well, to a certain extent, Kant thinks this is possible. Kant thinks that there is, in a sense, something that is given in experience, something that we could call the empirical subject. So, for instance, when you taste chocolate, and the taste of chocolate is accompanied by a feeling of joy, right? You learn something about yourself. Under a certain understanding of the term yourself, you learn that you like chocolate. Okay, that's an empirical fact, and it's an empirical fact about something that Kant calls the empirical self. And the empirical self is something that is like basically given to us in inner sense. But this empirical subject is just something that is given to us in experience, right? It makes no sense to say that it has the experiences. It doesn't play the transcendental role of a subject. When we think through what experience is, how cognition works, when we think through this basic subject-object relation, well, the empirical subject is actually a kind of object. It is something that is given in experience. It doesn't fulfill the transcendental role of the subject as that to which the object appears, as that to which the object is given. So the empirical subject, I mean, Kant is fine with that, but it's not the subject that we were looking for. It's not the subject that as it appears in transcendental philosophy. Okay, so in order to catch or find out what is this subject as it appears in transcendental philosophy, which we can loosely call the transcendental subject. What is this transcendental subject? Well, in order to understand that, we have to think about what is the role that the subject plays in transcendental philosophy. It is that to which objects are given, right? It is that which refers all experience to the transcendental object. Right? This transcendental subject is that which refers all experience to the transcendental object, which is sort of this positing of a basic ground for rules, right? Now, what Kant is going to emphasize when he talks about the subject is that it makes experience possible by unifying all the elements of experience in a single consciousness. Right? So if we return to my pencil, an experience, or I should say maybe like a sort of loose perception of blueness and a loose perception of rigidity and maybe a couple of other loose perceptions by themselves could never be or form or in any sense even sort of suggest the object of a pencil. Right? They have to be brought together. And in fact, much more than just them has to be brought together. All the experiences and all the possible experiences, one could say, that fall under the rule that is posited in the object have to be brought together in a single experience. Right? They have to be brought together in the consciousness of a single subject. Objects can only be given if they are given to a single subject. Right? We can't give every loose element of experience, so to speak, though the word experience would not really be the right word. We can't give all the loose elements of experience to like different subjects and then have experience any more than we can think a thought by taking some words like all sheep are animals, so 4 words, and having 4 different people think about this word. Right, and put them in a row and say, oh, this guy is thinking all, and this guy is thinking sheep, and this guy is thinking are, and this guy is thinking animals. So together they're thinking all sheep are animals. No, right, that's not how a thought works. That's also not how experience works. It has to be unified in a single consciousness. Otherwise, it's not experience. Otherwise, it's not a thought. So, what does the transcendental subject do? Or I should say, what is the transcendental role of the subject? That is the cleaner way of saying it. What is the transcendental role of the subject? It makes experience possible by unifying all the elements of experience in a single consciousness. And what's more, in order for this to really be experienced, the transcendental subject has to be aware of this unity. Right? It can't just be the case that there is some ungrasped unity. The unity must be grasped. Otherwise, no rule could be posited. Otherwise, the very idea of a rule wouldn't make any sense. So, the subject must be aware of this unity, and that means that it must be not just conscious, but self-conscious. Right? It must be conscious of itself as this unity of the experiences. And that is why Kant, when he talks about what I'm calling the transcendental subject here, why his carefully chosen term is the transcendental unity of apperception. So, the transcendental unity of apperception. Apperception is Kant's word for self-consciousness. He gets this from Leibniz. So, apperception is self-consciousness. There's a unity of self-consciousness, right? I mean, this consciousness that is aware of itself is a unity and is aware of itself as a unity. And this plays the transcendental role of the subject, right? The awareness of this unity is the transcendental role of the subject. And that is why we can call this subject the transcendental unity of the apperception. Okay, so how does this help us? Well, how does this help us bring about the kind of argument that Kant wants to bring about? Here I would like to quote a little bit of Gardner. This is from page 157 of Gardner's guide. He writes this: granted that the transcendental unity of apperception and the transcendental object are necessary for experience, right? And that's what Kant has been telling us, right? In the previous lecture, I've said that the transcendental object is necessary for experience. And now I've been telling us that the transcendental unity of apperception is necessary for experience. So granted that those are necessary for experience, what makes them possible? So far, Kant's account of the grounds of each is merely negative. Neither, he has argued, is empirical. Kant's master stroke in the deduction is to propose that each explains the other. Okay, Kant's master stroke in the deduction is to propose that each explains the other, that the transcendental object explains the transcendental unity of apperception, or the transcendental subject, and that the transcendental subject explains the transcendental object. Okay, how could that possibly work? Well, actually, we have already done most of the work. So a unity of the world of objects, like the very ability of being able to refer all our experience to each other, to an underlying rule, to a transcendental object, requires a transcendental act of synthesis. This is going to be one of Kant's favorite words in the deduction, affected by the transcendental subject through the a priori use of the understanding. Okay, let me say that again, because that might not be immediately clear. So, for there to be a unified world of objects, that is, for there to be a unified world, or for there to be the one experience, as Kant is going to say it, because all experience, if it is to count it as experience, it's got to be this unified whole, right? And maybe in order to see that, you can think of, like, what is in, like, how do we see that something is an illusion? Right, we see it because whatever it seems, like the object that it seems to present to us, doesn't fit in the unified whole that is experience. Right? I have this vision of an elephant, and I look again and it's gone, and there's no place that an elephant could have gone, and I think, whoa, that was not actually an objective experience. Right? That was not really related to an object. That was a mere subjective illusion, because it doesn't fit this unity. It doesn't fit this whole. So experience has this sort of inner unity. The world has this inner unity, and so there is a unity of the world, a unity of experience. But there can only be a unity of experience if all the experience that we have are unified in this one single consciousness, in this transcendental unity of the apperception. Through the a priori positing of a framework of rules. Right? There can only be a world of objects. So there can only be a single object. Positing a single object, I'm rephrasing this a couple of times to get it out exactly right for you. Positing an object means positing the ground for a rule of experience. Positing a world of object means positing an interrelated set of rules, or the ground of a unified ground for an interrelated and interdependent set of rules for experience. And we need the understanding for that. Right? So in order to be able to experience a world of objects, what the transcendental unity of the apperception, in a sense, has to do is it has to perform, using the understanding, using the categories, what Kant calls this transcendental act of synthesis. Right? It is the positing of this unified ground for this unified framework of rules that will be given to this single self-conscious unity. So we need, for a unified world of objects, rephrasing this in slightly simpler terms, to have a unified world of objects, we need a unified transcendental subject. If the transcendental subject were somehow split up, if there were more than one subject, there would be more than one experience, more than one world, which is, in a sense, I don't know, fine, but also doesn't make any sense. I mean, it wouldn't be like, they wouldn't be parts of the same world, they wouldn't be parts of the same experience, it would be something else, something different. It's not part of our story. At the same time, and now we get to something that we haven't really said before, but that should sort of solve the original problem that we had. How do we get a grasp of the subject? Well, this transcendental subject, as we have seen, must be self-conscious. So it must be aware of itself. And what we have seen at the beginning of this lecture is several ways in which it cannot be aware of itself. Right? It cannot be aware of itself as something that is given in experience. It can't be aware of itself as just experience as such. It can't be aware of itself as some kind of substance that underlies the experiences. The only way, the only grasp that we have of the transcendental subject, in a sense its only content, is its transcendental role, right? And its transcendental role is to be this unity in which the entire world of to which the entire world of objects can appear, right? The transcendental role of the transcendental subject is to be this unity, or to perform this act of synthesis in which the world of objects, the unified world of objects, can appear. But if that just is what the transcendental subject is, I mean, if we only grasp it through its transcendental role, if that's its only content, then that must also be the way that it grasps itself, right? So the transcendental subject is aware of itself only, and necessarily only, through an awareness of its own transcendental activity in carrying out this synthesis that posits the world of objects. So let me say that again. The transcendental subject must be self-conscious. It must be aware of itself. But it can be aware of itself only through an awareness of its own transcendental role, because it is exhausted by its own transcendental role. Its own transcendental role is to carry out this act of synthesis that posits the unified world of objects. And so, the self-consciousness of the transcendental subject must consist in its awareness of itself as positing a unified world of objects. Okay, what does that mean? Well, if self-consciousness implies and is implied by and basically sort of is the same thing as this awareness of synthesizing of experience, by which everything is sort of referred to this transcendental object that is the ground, that is posited as the ground for experience, then the transcendental subject can only exist if and as it posits this world of objects. And at the same time, this world of objects can only exist if it's posited by a transcendental subject. And so, the transcendental object requires the transcendental subject. And the transcendental subject requires the transcendental object. And neither of the two makes any sense apart from the other. Subject and object, Kant tells us, from the perspective of transcendental philosophy, subject and object cannot be pried apart. If we think through what the fundamental idea of an object is, and what the fundamental idea of a subject is, then we find that a subject is that which posits the object, and is aware of itself as positing the object, and that is its only sort of reality, its only self-awareness. It is what makes it what it is. It is a subject only through and in its self-awareness as that which posits the object. And the object is what it is only through its being posited by the subject. And so subject and object cannot be pried apart. And this means, well, first of all, we can see why, and I'm not going to try and work it out in detail here, but I think it's kind of clear how this would be the key to solving external world skepticism, right? Which starts out by saying, oh, there could be a subject without any objects. No, right? Kant says no. Basically, we've seen the solution. This, I think, this is his story to external world skepticism. So that's one thing we can see from that. And then returning to what we are most interested in, which was trying to show that we can know a priori that we will have experience of objects, right? That we can know a priori that we won't just have this, mere subjective play of sensations. We can know a priori that our experience will have this objective element in it. Well, we must have objective experience, because without objective experience there would be no we, or there would be no I. right? This might not be quite the same thing as saying that there couldn't be a being which is not self-conscious. I mean, probably there is. In fact, Kant thinks that animals, for instance, are not self-conscious, so they have a mere play of subjective perceptions. But we, like, as cognizing beings, as subjects in this strong sense of the word, must be in touch with a world of objects. That is part of what it is to be a subject. And that, it would seem, brings us to the conclusion where Kant wants to be. Right? That we must have experience of a world of objects. And that experiencing this world of objects fundamentally involves the transcendental, or fundamentally involves this transcendental act of synthesis, whereby the understanding posits a unified, rule-governed world of objects. Which, in other words, means a world to which the categories can be applied.